Yep.
Hi, guys. Welcome to today's stream. Thank you for joining us. Today, for Kuthban, we're going to be showing you how we do our 3D modeling. Mohammed, our lead programmer, will be leading this stream and showing you through the steps of how we make objects for our game in Unity. And yeah.
All right. Let me just bring it up. Yep. So hi. So we'll be learning today the basics of like 3D modeling, how the UI works, how to get started with 3D modeling, and I'll just show you some concepts of previous 3D modeling. So first things first, why 3D model? I mean, it's a bit obvious. You 3D model to create 3D assets. I mean, you could always buy them, but if you have the ability to create your own assets, it will allow you to, fine tune the assets to your own art style and allow you to, essentially create your own without spending extra resources or money on, someone else's 3D models that might not suit your art style. So right in front of me, I have Maya open. I mean, usually people use Blender because that's a free software. But I mean, even you high school students and university students have free access to Maya, which is, in my opinion, a lot. Oh, yeah, sorry. I think the screen share isn't working properly. Let me just reset. Yeah, hopefully you guys can now see the screen share. It's all good. Yep. So as here I have Maya opened up. I mean, it's your own personal opinion if you want to use Blender or Maya. I think both softwares are pretty good in their features, but I'm more familiar with Maya, so I'll go over that. So before starting 3D modeling, it's very important to have your model in mind, obviously, and with the model, you need references. So in this tutorial, I won't be showing any Kuthban specific 3D model, even though I would love to. Making a 3D model live will take a long, long time, like 4 or 5 hours just to get the basics modeled up, and then several more hours just to get it done. So I'll just show you some very basic techniques, and then I'll show you like saved processes of already the work I've already done. So when you're starting off with a 3D model, one of the first things you need to do is have references. So here's an old project of mine. I was making a Tommy gun for a first-person shooter back then. So over here, as you can see, you have tons of 3D references for the 3D model. You need essentially lots of different angles so you can know. Let me pull up one of them. So you essentially need clear pictures that tell you how the model looks like, because it's really hard to guess how something would look like without actually knowing it. You might mess up the, you know, how it looks, the shape of it. So a good idea is just go on Google and search for different types of search for the same thing and find all the different angles of them. Find maybe zoom ins of certain features, like for example the drum magazine. You and all the pictures are like front and back, but if you find something like the front or back of it rather than the sides, it's more easier to model then. So that's one of the main things. Before getting started with modeling, you need lots of references because that will make your life much more easier than trying to do guesswork. So before we jump into showing you how the main 3D modeling step is done, I'll just go over the UI because that's a pretty complex thing for whoever starts Maya out. So in here, you see all of these wacky buttons and all these different tools and stuff. For 3D modeling, you just need to know about the poly modeling tool, which contains all you need to model up. So one of the simple things, let me just delete that. And we get started with a cube, which is like the cube thing, and you get a cube. Um, if you use Unity or any other software like Unreal Engine, you might be familiar with how it works. You select the object, you have its normal three-dimensional axis. If you press E or R, you get the same functions of scale and rotation. So the first thing you need to do when you make a 3D model is upscale it. what's essential about upscaling is because some things require measurements to make cuts. So the bigger your object is, the less you need to make very precise cuts because you have more leeway with the size. So yeah, let's go over some of the tools for 3D modeling. So if you hold right click down, you see a bunch of options come out. All of these options pertain to different aspects of the object. So you have edge, vertex, UVs, vertex faces, and normal faces. So edges is essentially, highlighting all the different edges. So you can move the edge up and down, back and forth, and like that. If you go to vertexes, then each individual vertex of the mesh is highlighted, which can manipulate with more precision if you have a model with lots of vertices, which you'll eventually end up with. And then lastly, one of the other main one is face, in which you just select the face. So let me, before going over that, it's another important thing. So when you're starting off your 3D modeling, you need go to object mode if you want to select the entire object. So let me unhide all of this. So before you start 3D modeling, you first need to put an image plane in. It's simple. You go to essentially files, and in there's an image button. Sorry, then you import the image in, and then the image exists as its own 3D object within the plane. So essentially, you can align a 3D object within each axis to give you better referencing. So before starting 3D modeling off, it's very common for people to start blocking out stuff. So what does blocking out stuff mean? Essentially, you take the shape of the object over here of this gun. We need to break it down into simple shapes. For example, the main body of the gun is essentially a rectangle. The scope on is also a rectangle, while the drum is a circle. So you break the model down into different shapes. You get a better idea of its sense of scale and what to work on before you start working on a 3D model. So here, basically, what I've just done is just blocked out everything. Some parts have been modeled, some parts have not been. And this allows you to easily then, envision on what to do and set your goals on what to 3D model up. So now that we got all those basics out of the way before we start 3D modeling, I would like to show you how to do this process from start to finish, but essentially modeling takes a really long time, and I don't want to, just cut off in the middle of some basic shape modeling because that will take up the entire stream. So let's just go over here. For example, let's say I want to make a cone. Well, obviously the first principle I will be is obviously have references for the cone. But let's just say we just want to make a cone and I have the references with me. So first we'll press R, which will have the scale tool. So we put down the scale. Next, we need to essentially make the cone part of the cone. You have the square base of the cone. So you need to go to edge. So when you go to edge, you press shift and right click, which brings up different options for edge. So they're different to work with the bevels, essentially collapse edges together. But the important one that most 3D modelers use is multi-cut tool. What is multi-cut tool? It essentially allows you to place more polygons into the mesh. So if you hold control, you could have the options to place more polygons in here. So I'll just make a plus sign. I mean, it's not a plus sign. It's a bit of crude version of a plus sign. So, I mean, it's a bunch of pluses in the form of squares. And I'll just realign them. So look, all right. Another one is missing. Now we have a more developed mesh. So we have more smaller squares in the rectangle. So now we'll go to face. And here is the face mode. You press shift. I know it's in Unity it's control, but here it's shift. So you select all the squares and then you press shift right click. And here's a button, a convenient button called circleize components. So you press this and it automatically makes them more into a circle. So you have these further options to help you essentially manipulate the mesh more to what you want. A good practice is to keep your meshes as regular as possible. I could have easily made a cone like this, but the thing is all the polygons are messed up. And if you're working in a bigger team or in a studio, you also have someone who does the texturing and coloring of the model. So they will really struggle to do it if your meshes aren't more in regular shape. So that's a thing to be looking out for. And let's extend it a bit more with the offset. So now we have a mesh which has a circle cut up in the middle. Now we select all the faces and then we hit extrude. Extrude essentially allows you to pull up the mesh. So we'll pull up, let's say here, and then you can press R, which allows you to scale down the mesh. So let's say most cones have a flat top, and here. So here you see you have a basic shape of a cone. You can go and add more details. For example, cones might have some stubs at the edge. Again, it's the same process. You select some faces. Maybe you need more edges to manipulate stuff. You'll add more from the multi-cut tool. And you're like, oh, I need a small thing. I've seen in maybe references of cones, they have a small protrusion here. Okay, I'll add that. And you can extrude extruded things as well. So it's pretty flexible system. I'll extrude it again, but this time I'll scale it down. And here you have it. So that's most of the basic tools you'll be using with 3D modeling. But let's move on to the next thing. Is essentially smoothing the model. So we have a model here, but you're like, okay, it's good enough. We can import it. I mean, if we have a low poly style, which we do, it will be perfect as it has those very angular edges that you can see and it's very prominent. But what if you have a game that has a different art style or maybe has a more realistic art style? Well, then you need to smooth the mesh. What does smoothing the mesh mean? It means you need to make sure all the vertices do not collapse on each other and all the edges, sustain themselves. Bit of technical jargon, but essentially in Maya, I'm sure it's also the same, but in Blender, if you press 3, it shows the smooth preview after all the meshes have calculated. And if I press 3 here, you essentially see the rectangle turns into sort of rigid circle, which we don't need if, for example, you want square. If you want a square in your game, you want it more smoothed out. So an easy way to do it is add more edges to it. But why should we add edges to it? Essentially, what Maya and any other 3D modeling software does, when you when you smooth the mesh, it essentially collapses all the edges onto each other to make a more smoother shape. So if there are more edges between another edge, it will only collapse a certain distance. But since you see from this edge to this edge, it's a pretty big distance, so they'll collapse to the middle. So that will create its weird circular shape, but we don't want that. So essentially for that, we just add more meshes to every side. So for example, here we got this surface covered, we got this face covered. I mean, in more easier terms, you just need to make sure there's an edge for every other edge so it can hold on to it when it's smoothed down. So now we have one side done. So if we smooth it, you can see it's looking from one side much more like a square. Now from the other side, it looks more like a circle again, but a different circle because it still has some of the meshes from this side that it's trying to hold on to. But again, it doesn't have enough, it has too much gap to fill in, so it collapses into a cylinder. That could be good if you want to make some shapes that are like this, but you want to make a more smoother rectangle. Sorry, square. I keep on saying the other word. Oh well. And essentially, oh yeah, also you hold Alt to zoom around an object, similar to Unity. So, yep, I can say every single one has been done. Nope, I lied. Is missing. Oh, this one. Yep. So now we can see if you go in object mode, we have a smooth out square, which is a lot different from this very rigid square. And essentially it's a higher polygon count. And if you want to texture it, then you can add more high resolution shadows and stuff because it has more geometry to go around on it. So we can apply the same to here. If you press 3 here, and it looks like sort of a cone. It looks a lot deformed. So over here, it requires again same treatment, but it requires a lot more work as you can see, there's a lot more mesh. And which brings me to another tip. Don't start adding more edges until you're done with the initial layout of your model. I know sometimes you might be like, oh, I'm halfway through, might as well start adding edges to your object. Why is that a bad idea? If I need to then further edit the object or make it more detailed, all these edges that I added earlier to hold the smoothing would then interfere with my modeling and would cause me a lot more headache. And when then I need to add more edges to the same model again, then those it becomes just a mess. Then sometimes your model breaks, and then you most probably have to go really back again to the process. So we'll just apply the same treatment here. So go to every edge and make sure if you want that type of style, you add another edge to it so it doesn't collapse on itself. Very rinse and repeat stuff. A bit boring sometimes, but hey, that's how 3D modeling is. I mean, it's pretty fun. I mean, but unless you don't have music on in the background, it might get a bit exhaustive. Again, for the circle, we also want this. But here you can see it's not going all the way in a circle because the mesh isn't working that way. It goes from one side to another. I need to add several of these, make the mesh work. Oops. Another thing to add while I'm adding all the meshes is that Unity has a pretty robust undo system. In some games, you can undo certain things, sorry, in some engines. But here you can essentially, if you haven't closed the program yet, so I've made this entire cone in this one sitting. So if I keep on pressing Control Z, I can go all the back where it looked like a square. So that's pretty good in case you mess up a big step and you want to go a bit back, so you can retry it all again. Maya allows you to do that. I mean, it requires a bit more work, but essentially it has become a lot more smoother. I mean, this area could use a lot more work because remember earlier we added this thing here, but since we needed to add this, we needed to add another edge, and that edge went all the way through. So you need to also correct that edge as well. Let's see. And if I would select all of these edges, same here with shift. And again, I mean, 3D modeling, if you're starting out, I mean, I'm an amateur myself. I'm not a professional making cool 3D models of like Star Wars stuff or something like that. But it's a trial and error experience at the start because you won't know how to deal with every situation. But play around with the tools and try to move the meshes and see if that works. But most of the time it works out. Let's see. Takes a bit of a while because I added all those different edges. I go here and edit edge flow. So this essentially helps with the spacing of the edge. So you can turn it from 0 to 1, moves them a little bit, and it helped a little bit. But I mean, to solve this, you would need to go and separate all of these edges individually because you see this edge is very close to each other, so it will collapse onto each other in the midpoint, creating that crease. Same over here. You can add an edge here to stop the collapsing to that side and have it right in the middle. But essentially, you have to move these edges on evenly so that it doesn't create any rough edges. So once you have your 3D models made out, go on to the next step. And I'm just really speeding up the process, skipping a lot of things because in modeling, there's a lot of things. As you can see on the toolbar, there's a lot of functions to go ahead. And then once you select another stuff, you have the attributes bar, which goes over different types of how to control the mesh, how to manipulate it. I mean, sometimes you don't even use them at all. Sometimes you rely on them, but that just depends on the complexity of your task and what you're trying to achieve. So it has the tools if you want to use them. If you do not have any need to use these tools, they're just there. But it's just a point to know if you're run into some type of trouble, there's always a way. There's always a tool in Maya to help you with that. So with our crudely made 3D models, the next thing you do as a 3D model is you need to render it. Now, what is rendering? I mean, you already see stuff rendered here. How is that different? Well, these are rendered in essentially the low quality that allows smoothness for the program, where you wanted it to look, more amazing. You want it to look more stylish. So for that, you need to render it. Now for rendering, you have two options. One is your normal rendering, which you can go to. I hope I can find it. I think I removed it from my end because I don't use that much. Where essentially there's a normal renderer built into Maya, and there's another extension called Arnold. Arnold is a bit more better because it's used more professionally throughout the world. So if you mostly use Arnold, it would be more commonplace in bigger studios or companies where people render through Arnold. But before we render, we need to define some surfaces. So we go here. This is a plane tool. You might, if you use Unity, you might remember the plane from the Create 3D Object plane. It's essentially the same. It creates a 3D plane for you. If you don't put this in the mirror in this file and then we render it, it will essentially show an abyss. And sometimes you want to cast some cool shadows, show off your cool creative stuff. So we'll just add some things here. Some nice curved walls. I don't know if that's very artistic, but yeah. It's all up to trial and error experimentations until you find what looks cool. So before you render, one important thing, you need to add lights because the renderer will project lights. Here it's just showing it without lights and it's just the normal view you get. But if you render it, it's pitch black because there's actually no lights in the scene. So let's add some lights. So you go to create lights. You have different types of lights here. You have ambient light, which is essentially the low level light which just illuminates everything. You have directional light, which is just like the sun. It's a big, huge light which can cast its rays from anywhere. Essentially an important one. Point lights are just like spotlights, but the difference is of their baking, how they're baked. One requires a lot more baking, one requires a lot less, but they both give different types of shadows when they're made. And the other one is area light. Volume light, I haven't used that much, so I can't comment on that much. But let's go ahead with directional lights. So, I mean, it doesn't matter if I'm increasing its size, I'm just increasing it so I can see it better. So we want the light to be essentially pointing at this direction and its height to be adjusted here. So there you go. You click on the light and here you see the inspector. What type of color you want? Let's see. Let's add a bit of teal. And let's not forget the intensity. Now you need to experiment around with intensity to depend on what look you're trying to get out of. And then we have to make another camera for the renderer. That brings on to another cool feature. So right now you're hovering on this 3D space. You can see everything in different angles. But what if you want a fixed angle in each of the XYZ coordinates? Only you press space. And it brings up this. So it's essentially locked cameras in each of the directions. So if you want to model from the top down without accidentally moving stuff and having the perfect top-down view, you go to this. You press space again to come, basically to enter and exit, you just press space. Here's from the side, from the X and Y axis this way, from the Y and Z axis. So it's pretty cool. So let's create a camera. Camera. So we'll just also make it big so it's easier to see. So here we have our camera. You don't need to mostly touch these unless you want to achieve a certain look, but that's everyone's personal preference, and these are very self-explanatory if you know a bit functioning about cameras. The focal length, the angle of view. You can adjust FOVs and other types of vignette effects. Cool. Let's see. I always forget this step. I should have looked it up before the recording, but oh yeah, camera 1. Here we go. So this essentially shows you what this camera is looking at. So if we move this camera around, and essentially you can also work in this view if you want all 4 views at once. Let's go a bit down. And here, cool. So we have our camera. So before going there, you see this very faint white outline. I hope you can see it. If I move between scenes, you can see the box being highlighted. This is which camera is active right now. So I'll select this camera and I'll press Arnold, and then I press render. Now rendering is very intensive. Hopefully it doesn't crash my PC because it just fills up the RAM crazily. Well, let's wait for it to render and not move it around that much. Wait, let me just pause it here because it's no point in waiting for 10 or 20 minutes for it to fully render. No, I think it did fully render. Hey, that's nice.
Hamid, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, like, if we're sizing these objects for a game, how do we keep in mind, like, the size ratio of what the objects need to be? Like, what do we base it on?
Essentially, you can adjust the scale in the game. You can stretch it out, but you can always have a sample 3D model from an existing one. For example, if I want to make a cone that's as big as a tire car, I'll just import the 3D model of the car. So when I make the dimensions, it's more consistent. But either way, whatever you make, you can just go in Unity and scale it up. It most probably doesn't mess up the mesh that much, and it's still natural. But if you want exact scale, you'll most probably have reference images, like I told you, which will be more detailed reference images because they'll have scales in them built in, and you'll essentially use the scales here. So let me select here. If you go to Maya, so all of these are in centimeters. So if you want exact scales, you can edit them to whatever exact preference you want. But mostly that won't come into play that much. But in case it does, you could first of all have a reference object with a scale attached to it. Yeah, use the scales appropriately. And if you want to be more exact, then and just import the 3D model you want to compare it with in terms of size. So I hope that answers the question.
It does, yes. Thank you.
No worries. So here, after the rendering, you see it's a nice blue hue. You see more light particles bouncing around. This is a very low image. It's 9060 by 540, which is pretty low resolution. You can increase it, but yeah, I don't want to crash the stream. But even if you look at such a small render sample, it still consumes 835 MB of your RAM. So it's a very RAM intensive thing to render your stuff. So let's put it down there. And you can essentially add more lights. You can tweak around with the intensity of the lights. You can add more stuff. Let's go create lights, area light. You have an area light. Area light does affect its lighting with the size. So whatever you make is essentially a box of light. So if the box is bigger, it will emit more light. If the box is smaller, it will emit less light. So we have a cool area light here. Let's add a bit of fill light. Let's aim it down. Now you need to experiment with the intensity, because sometimes 5 intensity works, sometimes 50 works. It just depends on what the other lighting's intensity is. You can calculate that, but it's a lot faster than just trial and error it. There's no need to bother with all that. And once you got the lighting done for one of the 3 models, your other ones will also use the same preset. So, and that's a bit too red. Let's go a bit darker. So we come over here. Let's not forget to make this camera active, and let's render. Oh, nothing came about. Maybe the intensity is a bit low. Let's go full intensity. Children render. Is the direction wrong? It sometimes also happens. Let's see. Why is it rendering? Oh wait. Oops. I know what's wrong. Delete this. I'm using the other lighting system's area light, which is not compatible with Onward. So keep that in mind. If you're using a different lighting technique, make sure you go to its panel and select its area light. And if I still remember correctly, I always get this wrong. Should bother remembering this stuff. But the arrow pointing from the box is the arrow where the light comes from. And let's add the same hue. I know, terrible color choice. You have full teal with full red, but this one I show stuff around. So, I mean, you can really see it's a different one because it only had intensity, but now it has intensity and exposure. That's another cool thing to remind you that you're not using the right one. And still nothing. Let's increase the exposure. Still not. I don't know, isn't this a fickle thing? And can you stop rendering? Thank you. I don't want stuff to crash. It hung up for a second. Oh, wait.
This is a typical problem as well. It usually happens that you render something and then it doesn't render your latest change, and it's a I'd say that's a big frustration for anyone making anything in 3D modeling softwares.
Oh, yeah. See, you can see the struggles of modeling live. How about that? But hey, we got it. The intensity was less. So once we have more intensity, you can see it casting its red hue there. Obviously, you can play more around with the values to add more hue, but adding more lighting will require more rendering power. More rendering power require more RAM, and don't want to risk hanging my computer up. But that's essentially most of the basics. Another one, which is not essentially part of 3D modeling, but many 3D models essentially have this skill as well, which is called UVs. So what is UV, you might ask? Well, UVs are essentially their textures. So let me show you. You go to UV editor, and here you are. So this is the box, sorry, the square unpacked into 2D. Now, if you have, most of you might have taken, maths and geometry, you might recognize this shape when studying those subjects of how a flattened square looks like. So essentially, UVs are that. It's your object flattened out so that when a texture artist wants to color this square or add some cool designs to it, they essentially uh, edit this UV, and this UV then, essentially puts the texture on your model. You could, obviously, if you want to have more complex things and everything, they're all based on how the UVs look like. So here it's a square. It has this default, this one, because it's a simple basic shape. Maya already does that for you. It doesn't, it's like I got you. But if you go on something like the cone, now you see stuff is a bit more messed up. Now, why is that? It's because all the UV shells are on top of each other, and you need to essentially cut them up in the strictest sense. Uh, so you go to edge, you select the edges you want, and an easier way to do it is actually go to the 3D model. You see it reflects live on what edge is here. So let's try to separate a small part so it doesn't take much time. So let's zoom into here. First of all, let's make it the non-smooth one so it's a lot easier. See, you select the entire circle. Actually, that's a lot of small things. Okay, let's just do a basic one so I can just get the point across. We have this. So we have this here, it's selected, and you go cut. It doesn't do anything to the 3D model itself, but what it has essentially done is separated the UV shell. So here, this small UV shell has been separated. But this UV shell looks very small. You would think that it would be more bigger, but if you cut off even a bigger piece, it will be a lot smaller. That's because the scale is off. To fix the scale, and it was the align tool. Nope. And I've done this a lot of times, but I keep on forgetting where I put stuff around. All right. Okay, so I won't bother with that. You can also essentially make it bigger, stretch it out. And with all of your UVs, you must have a fixed scale. There's a tool here that keeps track of what scale is, what the current scale is. So you can apply all the scale to the same object. So they're all relatively bigger or smaller to each other and not bigger or smaller independently. And yeah, that's all the basic tools of 3D modeling, from modeling to lighting to texturing. I mean, setting up texturing for a texture artist. And yep, before we end this, let me just show you some 3D models once you dedicate the time and effort to do all of this stuff. And essentially 3D modeling takes a bit of time, but the more you're experienced with it, the faster you get it. So no biggie if your first 3D models aren't that good. So if you have played the game Final Fantasy VII, you might recognize this place. Look, let's select all of it. Boom. Yeah. Yay. So here, so if you have the time, I mean, obviously when you become a developer, you would have the time. That's essentially what you're going to do. And when you develop the skills and get the experience, you could 3D model cool stuff like this. So it's essentially an entire bar filled with all different types of stuff. I could also go over how to label stuff properly, but just label them generically, like label your glasses as glass, label your pipes as pipes. So when the texture tries to texture, he knows what 3D model he has selected. Should share it for you. So yeah, I think that's all about it.
Thank you so much, guys, for joining our stream today. If you have any questions on any of the processes of 3D modeling, of course, feel free to leave them in the chat and we'll try to respond to them. Join us for our next stream that's happening on Thursday, where we'll be talking a bit about this pre-process of things that will eventually move into 3D modeling. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Mohammed.
No worries. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in.